Hello, I'm Richard Chambers, and welcome to another episode in my continuing podcast series, Speaking of Risk and Audit. Today, I'm joined by Matt Mabel, the Vice President of Internal Audit, Quality Assurance, and Process Improvement with American Express. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and excited to be here.
Matt, help our audience understand a little more about your role and any background you'd like to share about yourself before we get underway.
Absolutely, yeah. So my current role, it's a very interesting one, probably a little bit unique in the internal audit space. I'm currently the Vice President over internal audit strategy, process, and product innovation. So it's spent a lot of time focused on our strategic planning process, and then, driving transformational change within the audit function, and then recently inherited our product team. So manage all of the business ownership of technology supporting the internal audit function. I also currently do oversee our quality assurance and improvement program, our QAIP. We are currently searching for a new vice president that's going to lead that role full time, but still have it until that is named. So, and quickly just want to give a little bit of context from the Amex internal audit function. Probably to the surprise of no one listening, we have a very large internal audit function. We have about 350 employees in our internal audit function globally right now. As the company and our U.S. bank increase its size and stature, risk and control management is a huge focus for the company across all three lines. So internal audit as well as other risk and control management functions are expanding rapidly. So I encourage everyone to keep an eye on opportunities at Amex.
You've got a great role there, and in many ways, very timely role, Matt, with some of the new IA standards around strategic planning. But I would ask you, sort of at the outset of our conversation, what do you think internal auditors' biggest challenges are when it comes to thinking strategically?
No, that's a great question. I think that, one of the biggest things for me is thinking strategically is really thinking beyond the page. So for internal auditors, I think we're so trained and conditioned to understand and break down and evaluate current processes and audit, activities in the past, that it is hard to become forward-looking. So I think it takes really thinking about questions like, what does my audit function not do well today? What are some things that we're not doing that we could be? What are some things that our peers that we aspire to be like are doing that we're not doing? Or what risks might the organization face tomorrow that we don't face today? So I think to answer those questions, you need to really kind of carve out the right time and the right brain power. Those are deep thinking type questions. And those are hard to do for a lot of leaders, in a world filled with meetings, filled with multiple competing priorities, filled with busy calendars. All of those things, I think, are inhibit, the ability to give the level of deep critical thought necessary, to answer those strategic questions from an audit perspective. So I think that, combined with the need to collaborate with stakeholders, both internally within the internal audit function and across the company, whose calendars and whose schedules are just as busy, is also a very important factor, as well as taking the time to really develop the external perspective, I think, are all very important to developing that strategic mindset. And all of that does take time and take brain power.
Matt, from my experience, and I'm sure you've encountered the same thing, a new strategic plan often necessitates change. And you also have responsibility to help internal audit navigate the change at American Express. And as a change management leader, what advice would you offer internal audit leaders who are trying to navigate change, or who are trying to prepare for the inevitable change that is headed their way, either as a result of a strategic plan or maybe even the market forces in general?
Yeah. So I think in my role leading change at Amex internal audit, I'd say the number one lesson learned, or the number one takeaway I have, is that you can never underestimate the importance of strong organizational change management. So project management is really focused on managing the resources necessary to deliver the desired products or services at the desired times. And that really ends when those products or services are delivered. There's a kind of finite end date when the project ends. Organizational change management, on the other hand, is really focused on the people side of change. And it's how to facilitate the successful adoption of the change and ensure that the expected benefits of the change are ultimately realized. So the change itself doesn't end until those expected benefits are actually achieved. In that regard, focus on things like stakeholder engagement, having strategies and plans for stakeholder engagement, and communications throughout the duration of the project and after the project, and a focus on training and skill acquisition. Those things, I think, are really the most important critical factors to successfully navigating change. I think about change in terms of people, process, and technology, and I quickly learned in my role that people is the hardest pillar to change. So I think there's a lot of good lessons learned there. I am a big advocate of kind of organizational change management. I'm probably a rarity in internal audit where I am a certified change management professional, a CCPM. And I think that's really, really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of the importance around things like that. Kind of broadening the thought process to just audit execution. We right now are at the IAA's Global Great Audit Minds Conference in Florida. And really the key theme in support of the IAA's vision is about elevating internal audit to be a strategic advisor to the business. So I think that as internal audit functions really look at a company's strategy and look at their big strategic initiatives, I think that the focus on some of these organizational change management risks and principles is a great way where we could deliver some meaningful insights to executive management on some of their biggest strategic priorities.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned stakeholders and talking about change. And, one of the things that I've noticed is when internal audit functions try to change, try to fundamentally change the way they serve the organization, sometimes the challenges aren't just inside internal audit. It isn't just getting everyone in internal audit to embrace the change. Sometimes it's getting the stakeholders. Any insights on how internal auditors can better position any proposed or potential change that they want to make so that it's better received by those they're serving?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it all comes back to kind of benefit and value realization. So, for instance, one of the big things we're working on is we're adopting some new technology within our audit function to better enable the audit process. So that costs a lot of money, especially to a place like Amex. These are big technology implementations. So we had to go to finance and request money. And so, how do you sell the long-term benefit that investment's going to have? How do you sell the benefit of the change to your to management, to business management, the people that you're auditing? How will this help you? We had to do a lot of that when we went big into data analytics. And so it's a big time investment that we needed from management to understand the data and get the data. But it was also selling them on here's the benefits you will receive when we're able to use analytics to drive our audit process in a more meaningful way.
Matt, the idea of having a quality assurance and improvement program for internal audit is not new. We introduced it in the 2002 major update to the internal audit standards, and it has been continually tweaked and revised. But the new standards, the ones that were adopted effective earlier this year, sort of reinforce the importance of having a quality assurance and improvement program. What key features or what key tenets should it have from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think I always like to put things in context. That you're working for an internal audit shop as big as Amex. We have a dedicated QAIP team that's probably bigger than a lot of our listeners' entire audit functions. So it does give me a unique perspective on the depth that we can go into to look at the quality of our audit function. I think the biggest things for me when I think about QAIP are really trying to balance the focus on conformance and performance. And I think performance is getting more stature in the new IAA quality standards. I think that, really looking at how we can really keep an eye on how to improve things in the future and have that perception as a group who really is trying to make the group better in the future and not just nitpicking the past, as auditors tend to do. And I think just instilling a culture of credible challenge within the team, I think are all really critical elements to having a successful QIP program.
Yeah. I know from experience in doing external quality reviews and having been a CAE, having my own quality assurance and improvement program that I had to ensure was being maintained effectively, that that it's a challenge. It requires a continuous commitment. You can't just set up a QAIP and then be done with it until the next external quality assessment. It's a continuous process.
It absolutely is a continuous process. At a place like Amex, where we have a whole team, it is literally a continuous process, and we have QA reviews happening throughout the year. Yeah, and I think how to, you kind of talked about from a change perspective, like how do you get the buy-in from the stakeholders that you need? So, I mean, in my role in QA, my stakeholders are my peers all throughout the audit function, and QA can tend to, much like an audit role, can tend to have an inherently adversarial kind of relationship. We work hard to overcome that. But, I think, again, kind of going back to those principles that we established, I think are very important, and making sure that we come up with meaningful outcomes, feel like we're adding value to them and not just picking apart what they do, becomes very important. I will say this in my quality review, I've been over the QA function for over 2 years now. I think the biggest insights I have are, I've found very rare occasions where I felt that the audit teams, clearly did dramatically the wrong thing or made just a horrible judgment call. Where I see a lot of things coming from a quality perspective is just the level in which they're able to articulate that. I've always thought throughout my career that being an auditor was like being a storyteller, and every test work paper tells a story and every audit tells a story. So I talked to my QA team and I talked to the audit group at large around, really being able to think about, what's the story that you're trying to tell, and how well, when you look back at your work papers, when you look back at the work product at the end, how well is that story articulated? And I tell the QA auditors all the time, I think it's more, just as if not more important, to think about what isn't documented as what is documented. And so that kind of mindset, I think, goes a long way for any audit person who's executing an audit to think about as they're evaluating management's process, and is particularly important for people in charge of review and supervision of more junior staff and of audit work, to be able to challenge that real time as they go through the process.
Yeah. Matt, the concept or the notion of a strategic plan sort of carries with it the attendant risks that you're not going to achieve your strategy. I've been regularly surveying internal auditors on what do they think are the biggest strategic risks they face in the next 5 years. And I just did that survey again toward the end of last year. The number one strategic risk in this case had to do with the inability to effectively leverage AI. But I would ask you, just in closing here today, talk to our listeners about what you consider significant strategic risks that face internal auditors and internal audit functions out there over the next few years.
Yeah, and I think the answer, kind of given my background, probably won't surprise a lot of people. As I mentioned, we're here at the IIA GAM conference, and the theme is really around how do we elevate internal audit into that role as strategic advisor. And I look at that ambition, that strategy that the IA has, which again I'm very much aligned with. And I think the biggest risk is how practically audit leaders at their companies are going to navigate kind of the organizational change management necessary to achieve that. How do we get our business partners past the mindset that internal audit is an assurance, a compliance, is a financial risk kind of siloed function, and how do we get to that point where we can elevate and get a seat at the table to bring more strategic insights to challenge the strategy of the company more and deliver new and different value there. I think that just from a profession standpoint, I think is going to be really critical. I think the IIA has laid out a great vision and a great strategy. It's now up to all of the audit leaders in practice to execute that. And I think I'd be remiss, you mentioned AI. I think that internal audit is not a place that is often looked at for great investment. So I think as companies, get more automated, get more data rich, I think how internal audit is able to keep pace with that pace of change from a technology and data perspective to stay relevant. We need to have timely insights in a world where those data insights are going to become quicker and quicker to resolve. So I think how audit is investing in themselves keeping pace with the business is going to be a major driver of success in the future, or a major risk of not achieving the ambition that the IA has for us as auditors.
Yeah. Well, real words of wisdom, Matt. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining me today in this podcast. And I want to thank our listeners for tuning in as well. I'm Richard Chambers for Audit Board, speaking of Risk and Audit.